Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Jacory Croskey-Merritt, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 2 running back rankings for the 2025 fantasy football season, going over my top 36 running backs. So if you're looking for my thoughts on a specific player, be sure to travel down below to the description as we have timestamps available there. While you're down in the description, if you have not yet already, of course, subscribe to the channel as I'm making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the season, whether it's rankings videos, whether it's hidden gems, live streaming every single day, so I can go ahead and help you get one step closer to capturing a 2025 fantasy football championship. And by subscribing today, not only are you going to gain an edge upon your league mates, of course, you're going to get us one step closer to achieving our goal of 100,000 subscribers. Now, besides subscribing to the channel, for those of you who want an even greater edge upon your league mates, be sure to travel down below and check out Betr. I'll be partnering with them for the entirety of the season, not only providing plays every single episode. I'll mention a couple over the course of today's episode in regards to Josh Jacobs and Austin Ekeler going into the Thursday game. But besides that, of course, providing rankings. All you have to do is sign up using code Andrew, make that first time deposit minimum of $10, and make a first time play picking more or less on two player statistics within a real cash play, and you'll be eligible to get my rankings every single Sunday morning for the remainder of the season. For my email directly to yours, these rankings are by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, and includes flex rankings to help you set your lineups and, of course, help you capture a 2025 fantasy football championship. So if you want to go ahead, take advantage of the new user special, in which if you go ahead and sign up today, you get a free $10. In order to take advantage of that, be sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your current location. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's get into talking about my top 36 running back rankings, beginning with our number one. This is Derrick Henry going into week 2, obviously coming off an incredible week 1 performance against the Buffalo Bills, in which we all saw on Sunday Night Football. He put up 28.7 half PPR fantasy points and carried our fantasy teams with 169 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns, an incredible performance in which he had 3 rushes of over 30 yards and a 6.0 yards after contact per attempt average. Derrick Henry was unstoppable, and unfortunately, he did fumble late in that game. And I think he's going to take out his frustration this week against the division rival in the Cleveland Browns. Last season against the Cleveland Browns, in week 8 and in week 18, he combined for 31 attempts for 211 rushing yards, 3 rushing touchdowns, a 6.8 yard per carry average against the Cleveland Browns in 2024. In those 2 games, in the game in which they won, 29.1 fantasy points. In the game in which they lost against Cleveland last year, yes, a shocking reminder that in fact the Baltimore Ravens lost to Cleveland last year. In that game, still put up 14.2 fantasy points. This week, the Ravens are an 11.5 point favorites at home. Expect for Derrick Henry to dominate with a huge performance here once again. The next running back is Christian McCaffrey. Now, we were all worried about Christian McCaffrey's calf going into week 1. Now, despite all that concern, we don't even have to worry about Christian McCaffrey as much anymore, as the remaining members of the San Francisco 49ers offense are finding themselves injured. I've said it before, there's something in the water in San Francisco that continues to force these players to get injured. George Kittle now going to the injured reserve, Jauan Jennings dealing with a shoulder injury, and Brock Purdy as well not only has a shoulder injury, but what is described as a serious toe injury going into this week where he is questionable. Regardless of how this all transpires, whether or not Brock Purdy's active, whether Mac Jones is starting this week, it's all going to lead to a lot of targets in the direction of Christian McCaffrey in the short term, in the absence of a George Kittle and a Jauan Jennings. Even though he was an inefficient runner in week 1 with 22 carries for only 69 rushing yards, again, he did what Christian McCaffrey does. 10 targets, 9 grabs, 73 receiving yards. He was targeted on 34.5% of the routes that he ran in week 1, and now has an opportunity of taking on the New Orleans Saints, a matchup in which, of course, the running backs of the Arizona Cardinals combined for 20 carries for 108, 10.8 fantasy points, but yet a 5.4 yard per carry average. I would anticipate Christian McCaffrey to have himself a great performance here in week 2. To continue the S here, we have Bijan Robinson. Speaking of an incredible performance, especially through the air, Bijan Robinson, very similar to a Christian McCaffrey, had himself 6 grabs, 100 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. We all saw early in the first quarter on red zone, of course, that incredible play in which Michael Penix checks it down to him and he goes for 50 yards and a touchdown. But, of course, the receiving work continued from there on. I mean, whether he was lining up out wide and running slants, whether he was utilized within the screen game, it doesn't matter. They continue to get him a lot of opportunities, and the checkdowns were consistent, primarily because the rushing efforts of this offense weren't as great as they typically have been. That Tampa Bay Buccaneers run-stop defense looked good, whether it was Bijan Robinson or Tyler Algier. And speaking of Algier, unfortunately, he did handle 10 rushing attempts, which I truly believe are unnecessary. And as we progress throughout the season, I'm hoping we'll see less and less opportunities in the direction of Algier. But for those of you who are worried about the opportunity share that he saw, in terms of snaps, Bijan Robinson played nearly identical snap share in comparison to the last 5 games of the 2024 season as he did in week 1 of 2025. So I'm not worried. I think the rushing yards are going to increase. And as long as that target opportunity continues to stay consistent, taking on Minnesota this week should be a fantastic play once again. Number 4, we have Jahmyr Gibbs, who unfortunately, for those of you who don't play in a full PPR, was quite underwhelming because he only had, again, 50 total all-purpose yards, 19 on the ground, 31 through the air on 10 receptions. Now, when we look at this game back, again, the Green Bay Packers at the line of scrimmage dominated. Just completely dismantled the Detroit Lions running game. 16 of the Lions' 22 rushing attempts, whether it was a running back, quarterback, or a wide receiver. 16 of the 22 carries from this offense led to the ball carrier being hit in the backfield. Again, when 44.5% of Jahmyr Gibbs' rushing attempts were stuffed at the line of scrimmage, it really gives us an indication as to the offensive line of this Detroit Lions attack just wasn't up to par in comparison to what the Green Bay Packers were providing. Even despite all this unfortunate reality within the rushing category, luckily Jahmyr Gibbs got himself 10 receptions for 31 yards, which was highly influenced by the negative game script, which forced him to play 66% of the snaps. Now, from watching back week 1, a couple of the positives for Jahmyr Gibbs, even though there weren't many, a couple of the positives. In terms of early down usage, he dominated in comparison to David Montgomery on one running back sets. He played 32 of the first and second down snaps in comparison to David Montgomery playing just 14. Therefore, if we're going to go into a softer matchup against the Chicago Bears this upcoming week, I would expect a bounce back performance here from Jahmyr Gibbs, who should continue to stay on this track of 20 plus touches per game. And of course, being at the top tier of this running back position. The final of our S tier is Saquon Barkley. Of course, he takes on the Kansas City Chiefs. We have a little bit of a Super Bowl rematch. You guys know that I talk about this all the time. The Kansas City Chiefs run-stop defense is elite. When we go back to 2024, the Kansas City Chiefs allowed the second fewest yards per carry on average to opposing running backs, 3.76, and they've continued that streak of success thus far this season in week 1, only allowing 3.31 yards per carry to opposing running backs. Now, of course, Saquon Barkley always has the ability to be able to outperform a defense. And considering how elite his offensive line is, it is all trending in the right direction. But of course, for another consecutive game here, we have Jalen Hurts stealing touchdowns near the red zone. Obviously, Jalen Hurts 2 rushing touchdowns this most recent week. Even though Saquon Barkley did find the end zone, we're hoping for him to find the end zone this week to make himself a stable play, despite how difficult the upcoming matchup is against the Kansas City Chiefs. All right, let's move on to the A tier, where we have Josh Jacobs, who will be taking on the Washington Commanders this upcoming Thursday night. Now, over the course of the last 9 consecutive games, Josh Jacobs has scored 1 rushing touchdown minimum. He continues to see himself elite levels of opportunity, in which he has had, over the course of those 9 games, 17 touches minimum every single game. So we would anticipate going into the short week, where this offense continues to lean upon the run game, to of course expect Josh Jacobs to find success against the Washington Commanders. If you were to potentially make a play via Betr, a potential anytime touchdown for Josh Jacobs, considering the 9 consecutive game streak, whether it's on the ground, through the air during the regular season, I think that's a pretty solid play via Betr. But again, as of right now, the game on Thursday has a total of 48.5. That is the second highest total implicated going into this week. This should be a shootout. And if in fact it is, of course, maybe there's potential for even more than 1 touchdown for Josh Jacobs. Number 7, the thumbnail of today's episode, is Kyren Williams. Look, Kyren Williams is following in the footsteps of Josh Jacobs in terms of a consecutive game streak of scoring touchdowns. Kyren Williams, when we look at the last 7 games he has played, 6 of them in the regular season consisting of 1 touchdown minimum. So 6 of the last 7, a pretty solid rate. Now you have an opportunity of taking on the Tennessee Titans, in which they are 5.5-point favorites on the road in Tennessee. You would assume that, of course, this Los Angeles Rams team should come away with a victory, and in doing so, they're going to run the ball a lot in the second half, just like the Broncos did. The Broncos, their running backs combined for 22 carries, 133 yards and a touchdown, 19.3 fantasy points just off of rushing statistics alone, which is the 5th most allowed in week 1. Therefore, if the Tennessee Titans, who even last season were allowing 15.62 fantasy points per game on the ground alone to opposing running backs from weeks 1 through 18, you would anticipate Kyren Williams to continue to, of course, batter this defense behind the solid offensive line. We have our number 8, Chase Brown, taking on the Jacksonville Jaguars. Listen, he continues to get elite levels of opportunity, coming off of a game in which he had 24 opportunities and 23 touches. So even with a couple sprinkles of Samaje Perine, it didn't matter. Chase Brown is continuing to get himself the bulk majority of touches, and as long as that continues, he's going to prove to everyone how valuable he is for fantasy purposes. Now, even though the rushing opportunities of 21 attempts only led to 43 rushing yards, luckily he did score a rushing touchdown. He forced 6 missed tackles in week 1, which amongst all players was in the top 2 of the discussion. And unfortunately, yes, the Cincinnati Bengals early in the season, weeks 1 and 2, over the course of the last couple seasons here, have really struggled year over year in terms of scoring as an offense. But going into the Jacksonville Jaguars matchup, this current total is the highest of week 2 with a 49.5. We're expecting a shootout between these two high-powered offenses. Number 9, we have Achane taking on the New England Patriots. Look, the New England Patriots defense, even though they played incredibly well against Ashton Jeanty in the rushing efforts of the Las Vegas Raiders, where Achane is going to thrive is not only on the ground, but where he finds his success is through the air. And even though he only came away with 3 receptions for 20 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown, which was on 4th and 11, by the way, he did save the entire game for the Dolphins. If it wasn't for Achane running over multiple defenders to get himself in the end zone and willing himself to scoring 15 fantasy points, many of us would have had a dud performance there. But just looking back to this most recent week, of his 10 total touches in week 1, 6 of them consisted of 6 or more yards. He had forced 4 missed tackles, which over the course of 10 total touches is a pretty good rate, a 40% rate. So now that you go into a matchup against New England, where we, of course, are expecting this to be a game in which the Miami Dolphins should be able to compete in comparison to where they were in Indianapolis this past Sunday, when we travel back to 2024 and look at the Week 12 matchup in which Achane took on this defense, 10 carries for 32, 3 receptions for 24, and 2 receiving touchdowns for 19.1 fantasy points. We are hoping to get far more target opportunity in the direction of Achane in order to keep Tua Tagovailoa not only in rhythm, but away from the pressure of the pass rush that continues to get to him on a daily basis. Moving on to our number 10, we have James Conner to begin the B tier. This is another consecutive week in which I have him in my top 12, and it's not by accident. It's purely because of their schedule. They take on the Carolina Panthers this week. We just saw the Carolina Panthers get demolished by the rushing efforts of one Travis Etienne. But when we look at the entire running back efforts on the ground from the Jacksonville Jaguars, we're talking about 25 carries for 173 rushing yards, which led to 17.3 fantasy points, which was the 6th most allowed in week 1. Now, when we travel back to last season, of course, James Conner has experience against this Carolina defense, as he went for 15 carries for 117 and a touchdown, 4 receptions for 49, and 25 fantasy points and a half PPR. The Cardinals this week are 6.5-point favorites at home. Like I mentioned last week, during the 2024 season, when the Arizona Cardinals were home favorites over the course of the year, he was averaging over 18 fantasy points per game. I'm expecting a lot of upside here for James Conner and hopefully a lot more rushing yards with the opportunities that he is given. Number 11, we have Jonathan Taylor, who takes on the Denver Broncos. Really, this is going to be a true test of strength for what the Indianapolis Colts are in 2025. Obviously, they blew the barn doors off of that Miami Dolphins defense. Obviously, Jonathan Taylor, 18 carries for 71, 3 catches for 27. In terms of opportunity share, this is a 6th consecutive game for Jonathan Taylor where he has 20 or more touches. Now, Daniel Jones, unfortunately, went ahead and stole 2 rushing touchdowns on the goal line with the QB sneak, tush push, whatever you want to call it. But going forward, we would anticipate that, of course, Jonathan Taylor is going to be given a little bit of those opportunities. And, of course, he will be able to develop these 10-point performances to 16, 20-point performances in those bigger weeks. Last season, he did take on Denver late in the year, in fact. Week 15 against them, 22 carries for 107 on the ground. We would assume very similar production with the upside of hopefully finding the end zone as well. Number 12, we have Bucky Irving. Look, I understand that Bucky Irving's overall efficiency level wasn't relatively close to what he was able to produce in 2024. But what was very promising was the absence of Rachaad White within the opportunity share. Again, Bucky Irving coming away with 18 total opportunities in 18 touches. And very similar to the final 2 games of the 2024 season, Rachaad White only coming away with 3 touches. Therefore, if we're going to continue to see Bucky Irving, who is coming off of a game in which he played a career high 76% of the offensive snaps in a singular game. Again, he didn't hit that watermark a single time in his rookie season. As long as he's continuing to see elite level opportunity, 18 total touches, a lot of snaps, they're lining him up out wide. Of course, he's continuing to get himself utilization within the receiving category, taking on the Texans this week. Even though they are, of course, underdogs, I would still anticipate to see Bucky Irving highly implicated for a solid top 12 week, especially considering what Kyren Williams in that offense were able to accomplish, despite all of the offensive consistency that the Rams had in week 1. I think Bucky Irving, again, in a position to succeed here in week 2. Number 13, to close out this tier, we have Ashton Jeanty, who very similar to Bucky Irving, a very inefficient week 1, but the opportunity share was there. 21 total opportunities, 21 touches. That is an elite level workhorse back that if he's going to continue to see 20 plus touches per game for the remainder of the season, he's always going to be implicated in being fantasy relevant. Now, even though he had himself a tough matchup against New England and his offensive line did him no favors with a 0.4 yards before contact per attempt, one of the worst in week 1 of the NFL season. I mean, he was at the level of what Tyrone Tracy had to deal with in week 1, which again speaks volumes considering, again, you would have hoped that the Raiders offensive line in terms of the run blocking category would have been a little bit better. I mean, in terms of Ashton Jeanty's rushing attempts, of the 19 attempts, 42% of them, he was stuffed at the line of scrimmage. So I would like to hope that, of course, this Las Vegas Raiders offensive line are going to get back to the basics, going to improve, and as they take on a division rival with the Los Angeles Chargers, even with a tough matchup on hand, the volume of opportunity that Jeanty is given, he'll be able to at least break out a couple of those runs to make himself, of course, a solid top 15 option this week. Continuing on to our number 14, we have James Cook, who found the end zone and, of course, a lot of utilization through the air with 5 targets, 5 catches, 58 against the Baltimore Ravens in a negative game script. Of course, he had to get utilized, and on one of those passes, of course, goes 40 yards down the field, tackled down at the 2-yard line. 2 plays later, unfortunately, Josh Allen is rushing it in for a touchdown. Of course, we've seen that year over year here within this offense, but going forward, as long as James Cook continues to get himself a very similar level of opportunity, 18 touches in this most recent game against the Baltimore Ravens for 18.7 fantasy points, as long as that opportunity share is there, that's fantastic because he's coming off of a game in which he had the highest percentage of snaps played since week 5 of the 2024 year. These are all positive signs on top of the fact that the Buffalo Bills are 7-point favorites on the road against the New York Jets this week. If they take an early enough lead in this capacity, and of course, the New York Jets offense flounders at points, this could lead to a lot of rushing in the second half for someone like James Cook. But I do think this could be a closer scoring game than many anticipate, or at least where it's currently being set at via Vegas. All right, let's move on to our number 15. Speaking of Breece Hall, one of the main contributors as to why the New York Jets looked so good in week 1. I mean, Breece Hall, 4 rushing attempts of 10 or more yards. That's 21% of his rushing attempts. Again, that's a ridiculous number on top of the fact that 47% of his rushing attempts led to 5 or more yards in week 1. Now, besides the fact that he came away with 15.5 fantasy points in a half PPR, had 3 touchdowns vultured inside the 10-yard line, 1 by Braylon Allen and 2, of course, by Justin Fields. Now, it wasn't like he wasn't given opportunities. He had rushing attempts inside the 10-yard line, but unfortunately, the offensive line, the defensive efforts, it didn't really lead to success. Therefore, there were alternative options in the form of Justin Fields keeping it, and of course, Braylon Allen rushing forward for a huge rushing touchdown inside the 10. But as we proceed, Breece Hall, who looked incredible, I mean, really did look like, a former version of himself. I did not see that kind of a Breece Hall in 2024. It did remind us of late 2023. And as we proceed, when we take on the Buffalo Bills, the division rival, and we look at the 2024 efforts of Breece Hall, he was still solid against that defense. 28 carries for 158 yards, a 5.64 yard per carry average, and averaged over 12.5 fantasy points per game against the Bills last season in the 2 matchups. A Bills defense that couldn't stop a soul in the run game, as of course Derrick Henry slaughtered that defense, as the Baltimore Ravens running backs combined for 21 carries, 160 yards, and 2 rushing touchdowns. I truly do believe that Breece Hall is going to have himself a solid week here, especially when we consider how great his offensive line played. He was number 3 amongst all running backs in week 1 in terms of yards before contact per attempt with an average of 3.3. I mentioned it just moments ago. Ashton Jeanty had an average of 0.4. Again, a huge difference there. 16 is Chuba Hubbard taking on the Arizona Cardinals. Despite the negative game script in week 1 for Chuba Hubbard, still got himself 21 opportunities and 19 touches, 16 on the ground, and of course 5 targets through the air that led to 3 receptions, and of course his singular receiving touchdown down the sideline in, of course, garbage time. We will take it. Now, despite all the concern this offseason in regards to Rico Dowdle and his utilization, Rico Dowdle is playing exclusively on the 3rd down snaps. But when we're talking about the 2-minute drill, it is still Chuba Hubbard. Chuba Hubbard's not going away, and his opportunity share is still very much so consistent, which we were very much so concerned about this offseason. But it is evident that, of course, Chuba Hubbard is going to continue to be an elite running back in terms of opportunity share, and that's going to turn him into a workhorse once again. They take on the Arizona Cardinals this week, which again is an advantageous matchup in my mind, especially considering what Chuba Hubbard was able to accomplish against them last season in week 16. 25 carries for 152, 2 rushing touchdowns, and 30.5 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. We're hoping for similar levels of production here in week 2. Number 17, Alvin Kamara. Look, this is the first time that I have seen Alvin Kamara, and I even looked back in the history books. This is the first time that Alvin Kamara has had less than 3 receptions in a loss since 2022. That's how long it's been. And the reason why I went ahead and I looked that up is because I put together a lot of better plays this past weekend in regards to, Alvin Kamara surpassing 2.5, 3.5, 4.5 receptions and going more on that number. But unfortunately came away with only 2 targets, 2 receptions, and 12 receiving yards, while guys like Juwan Johnson, Chris Olave, Rashid Shaheed were heavily targeted. Now, hopefully going into the matchup against the San Francisco 49ers, Rattler will be looking in his direction far more often because we truly are dependent on those targets leading to fantasy points for someone like Alvin Kamara. That is how he has made his entire career. There's a reason why Alvin Kamara in his career has never rushed for 1,000 total yards within a season. It's primarily because, again, he thrives within the receiving game. Now, of course, this most recent week, we did see a lot of Kendre Miller and Devin Neal as they both combined for 7 attempts on the ground for 33 yards. That, I think, is promising because at least it does keep Alvin Kamara fresh. But if we're going to continue to dig into his overall workload of opportunity, it does hurt him and move him down the list in terms of his potential for upside within a given week. Number 18 is Javonte Williams, a running back that, yes, even though in last week's video I didn't have him ranked, on Patreon in terms of my rankings on Thursday afternoon, I had him ranked. Was he close to the top 15 or the top 10 where he finished? Absolutely not. But he was certainly in my top 36, but he performed far better than I anticipated considering he found himself in the end zone twice. Now, in terms of the competition within this backfield, Miles Sanders obviously got himself the second RB role. Jaden Blue was a healthy scratch in week 1. Miles Sanders, after he fumbled, didn't play a single snap after that for the remainder of the game. Therefore, if this is going to lead to Miles Sanders pretty much falling out of favor, and of course Javonte Williams having the full reign of this backfield, then that's fantastic. But in the event in which Jaden Blue is no longer a healthy scratch and he takes over for Miles Sanders, that could dig into the overall workload of Javonte going forward. But as of right now, he has the clear pole position and now has an opportunity of taking on the New York Giants this week. I think this is an automatic start based on matchup alone. The Giants in week 1 allowed 21 carries for 152 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, which is 27.2 rushing fantasy points to the running backs and Deebo Samuel of the Washington Commanders. I mean, again, the New York Giants as an organization just haven't been able to stop the run since 2021. In fact, since 2021, in each of those individual last 4 seasons, they have been top 6 in terms of rushing yards allowed to opposing teams over the course of those seasons. Therefore, of course, as the top of the conversation, once again, Javonte Williams, an automatic play here against the Giants defense. Another one of these running backs that broke out in week 1 is Travis Etienne, with 16 carries going for 143 rushing yards. Tank Bigsby being traded to the Eagles yesterday afternoon. All signs are pointing towards Travis Etienne having immediate value in the short term and potentially for the remainder of the season if he continues to play incredibly well as he did this past week against the Carolina Panthers. Now, again, the elite level of opportunity leading to 19 total touches is incredibly promising, on top of the fact that he played 70% of the offensive snaps on early downs, which is first or second down. Now, LaQuint Allen did end up playing 8 of the 10 third down snaps, which does call into question as to whether or not Bashal Tutin is going to get any sort of rush. But going forward, it seems like Travis Etienne and the confidence of the organization to continue with him, having traded away Tank Bigsby, does give me the confidence now to, of course, assume that in a game this week against Cincinnati Bengals that struggle early on in the season. And again, this game is assumed to be a high-scoring shootout as they are currently at a 49.5 point total in week 2, which is number 1 amongst all games this week. When you take into account how well Travis Etienne played, how well the offensive line played, he was number 4 amongst all running backs this most recent week. In terms of yards before contact per attempt, 2.9. When you're getting that level of push up front, it does really allow your running backs to dominate. And of course, we would hope that continues this week in Cincinnati. Moving on to our number 20, we have Omarion Hampton. Really quickly, for those of you who have been asking me over the course of the last couple of days, live streams, Patreon messages, etc., Andrew, where should I be looking in terms of potential trade options? I am trading for Omarion Hampton when I get an opportunity to do so. He is a buy low candidate in my mind in an ascending offense. Based on how well the passing attack looks for Justin Herbert and how easily they cut through that Kansas City defense, I truly do believe that now that you're going to see matchups in which they're not playing against Kansas City every week for the remainder of the year, Omarion Hampton will be significantly better. And sure, Najee Harris did end up being active, but he had 1 rushing attempt. It is not going to be impactful against the potential upside of Omarion Hampton for the remainder of the season. As they take on the Raiders this week, I would anticipate for him to have himself a far greater performance, and it may be the final week in which you may have an opportunity to be able to go after the team in your league that has Omarion Hampton and speak to that manager and potentially get yourself an opportunity at a running back that is going to have himself a lot of upside for the remainder of the year. Number 20, we have Tony Pollard. Look, I understand that he had himself an underwhelming performance with the fumble. He went from 9.4 fantasy points and a half PPR to only 7.4. But again, without Spears, he's going to continue to get elite level opportunity. 19 total touches in week 1. As of right now, they're 5.5 point underdogs at home against the Los Angeles Rams. And as long as he continues to get himself this kind of level of opportunity, there's a pretty good likelihood that he may even fall into the end zone this upcoming week. If it wasn't for all the drop passes that, of course, Cam Ward had to deal with from the receivers of this offense, we were probably going to be in a position in which they would have scored a couple more field goals and kept that game close. In my mind, if they can compete with the Denver Broncos, then they can compete with a team like the Los Angeles Rams early on in the season, which of course will allow someone like Tony Pollard getting this level of opportunity to be fantasy relevant once again. Number 22, J.K. Dobbins. Now, speaking of level of opportunity, he had 18 total touches in week 1, identical to Tony Pollard, who we just previously mentioned. J.K. Dobbins, clear and away, is the lead running back. 18 total touches, played 53% of the offensive snaps, and was able to handle 16 of the team's 22 running back rushing attempts, which is 73%. So when you're handling that kind of a workload share, and we saw RJ Harvey not even get utilized within the receiving game, sure, Harvey was able to get himself a huge run and looked great in terms of his overall breakout potential in terms of that regard, but as it currently stands with Tyler Batty being the primary receiving back, J.K. Dobbins getting more targets than Harvey, it seems like the Harvey situation is something for the future. And in the meanwhile, as J.K. Dobbins is relevant, taking on the Indianapolis Colts, a defense that was giving up 6.6 yards per carry to opposing running backs in week 1, they haven't been tested yet on the ground because, of course, the Miami Dolphins weren't, of course, allowed to, considering they were down early in that game and game script did not allow for it. But I would assume J.K. Dobbins should have himself a pretty good outing here against this Indianapolis run-stop defense in week 2. Number 23, we have DeAndre Swift. Again, opportunity is king in fantasy football. 20 total touches on 22 opportunities. And even though he wasn't able to be as efficient as we would have liked, and the offensive line wasn't getting much movement up front against that Minnesota Vikings run stop, again, there is still a lot of opportunity this week against Detroit in a revenge game in which DeAndre Swift takes on his former team, and so does Ben Johnson. There is an opportunity here in which DeAndre Swift can be fantasy relevant. Now, of course, 5 targets, 3 catches, 12 receiving yards. Very promising numbers, especially when we consider Kyle Monangai did not see much utilization. Roschon Johnson still dealing with a foot injury. This all leads to DeAndre Swift continuing to be heavily utilized within this offense, which will continue to keep him in this top 24 conversation. Speaking of number 24, we have Zach Charbonnet, who was the surprise outside of guys like Dobbins, Etienne, Javonte Williams in week 1 having incredible performances. Zach Charbonnet coming out and completely dethroning Kenneth Walker was quite a surprise. Now, when we look at the big picture of this backfield, in terms of early down snap share, he played 43%, 12 of the early down snaps, first and second down, in comparison to Kenneth Walker, who played 16 of those early downs. But where Charbonnet made the biggest difference was playing 100% of the goal line opportunities and 71% of third down opportunities. So if he's going to be on the field for those opportunities, and he's going to continue to dig into the overall workload of someone like Kenneth Walker, we have seen Zach Charbonnet last season, when given, the entire backfield to himself, be able to average over 17 fantasy points per game and a half PPR, over 19 in a full PPR. Incredible production. Now, in the event in which this week, which we have another backfield split in terms of total touches, that's why I have him at number 24. I would assume that he is going to continue to lead this backfield as they take on the Steelers that couldn't stop a soul within the running game last week, having given up 134 on the ground to the Jets running backs and 1 rushing touchdown. If it wasn't for Fields, it could have been 3 rushing touchdowns. All in all, Zach Charbonnet amongst all running backs in week 1 had the highest rushing success rate at a 67%. We would assume if he's going to continue to find that level of success in comparison to the inefficiency of Kenneth Walker, he will continue to maintain as the lead back of this offense. Now, before we continue to the rest of our top 36 rankings, a quick reminder for those of you guys who want all-encompassing rankings, want to be able to ask me questions, want to get Discord community server access that is exclusive to Patreon, all you got to do is check out the link down below and travel on over to Patreon. Of course, I've been helping people win fantasy football championships over the years via the Patreon, so for those of you who are interested in, of course, getting any and all of your fantasy football questions answered, whether it is a trade question, whether it's a waiver wire question, starter sits, getting my all-encompassing rankings every single week, every Thursday and Sunday, all of this available there for those of you who want additional content and want to, of course, go ahead and get my opinions on any and all of your questions, whether I'm live or not. Again, this is a great way to get my access over the course of the remainder of the season. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, continuing on with our number 25, we have Tyrone Tracy Jr., who I understand had an incredibly inefficient week 1 with 10 carries for 24. But when we look at his success rate, he actually had a pretty solid success rate in terms of his rushing attempts. So if it wasn't for the unfortunate reality of the offensive line really just not doing much up front and getting dominated at the point of attack by the Washington Commanders, Tyrone Tracy would have had a better week. Now, I would have loved to have seen him got far more receiving utilization, but as we approach this week, I'm assuming that the New York Giants as a whole, they'll overhaul themselves and they'll look a lot better, as they didn't score a single touchdown in week 1 against the Commanders. Of course, Russell Wilson was 17 of 37 passing. It doesn't get worse than that. So if we approach this week against the Dallas Cowboys and the script aligns itself to being far more running back friendly, we should see some success. Now, I understand this most recent week, Saquon Barkley behind an elite offensive line found a lot of success on the ground. I don't expect that kind of level of success from Tyrone Tracy, but as long as the receiving utilization is there, he should still be relevant in the top 36 capacity, but specifically as my number 25. Number 26 is Jaylen Warren. I understand that many of you look in the direction of Kenneth Gainwell as a potential waiver wire pickup. I personally don't think that Kenneth Gainwell is a long-term answer for the organization. There's a reason why they went ahead and they inked a new deal with Jaylen Warren, and there's a reason why he had 13 touches this most recent week and scored nearly 13 fantasy points, put up 12.9 to be exact and a half PPR. He handled 58% of the running back rushing attempts in this backfield, and I truly do believe he is the most relevant running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Caleb Johnson's role pretty much ensures that Jaylen Warren is going to get the goal line overall opportunities. And over the course of week 1 against the Jets, he in fact did that. Inside the red zone, he handled every single rushing attempt from the running backs. Therefore, we should anticipate him to continue to get more opportunity in that direction in week 2. Number 27, we have TreVeyon Henderson. Look, the receiving workload was very promising. For those of you who play in a full PPR, you shouldn't be afraid to play him. But if you are playing in a half PPR, in the standard league, it becomes a little bit more tricky. Now, if it wasn't for the fact that TreVeyon Henderson had 2 of his rushing attempts called back due to holdings, he would have had an identical amount of rushing attempts in comparison to Ramondre Stevenson. Now, with that being said, and that opportunity share being a 50-50 split between the two of them, Ramondre Stevenson still dominated in terms of snaps across the board. Whether it's early down, first and second down, whether it's goal line, whether it's third down, whether it's 2-minute drill, Ramondre Stevenson played the bulk majority of opportunities in terms of snaps. Now, going into this week, we heard from, of course, Mike Vrabel after the game. He said, we have to run the ball better. We have to run it more efficiently. If that's going to be the case, you got to hand the ball off to TreVeyon Henderson on a far more consistent basis, as Ramondre Stevenson only averaged 2.1 yards per carry in week 1. I think the door is opening for the full takeover from Henderson, potentially in week 2, but hopefully by the time that we get to week 4, it'll establish itself at that point. Number 28, we have David Montgomery. Look, like I mentioned earlier with Jahmyr Gibbs, 16 of the 22 carries for the Lions in week 1 consisted of the ball carrier being hit in the backfield. Now, despite the negative game script, he still touched the ball 15 times, 11 on the ground, 4 through the air. He still played 37% of the offensive snaps in a negative game script and was able to get himself 9 of his overall 11 rushing attempts on first and second down. Now, the only reason that he didn't get more rushing attempts is because the Lions didn't get many first downs. They had 17 total first downs in this game. To go ahead and put into perspective just how low of a number that is in comparison to what we saw from the Lions last season, in the final 7 regular season games of the 2024 season, the Detroit Lions were averaging 28 first downs per game. Just to put into perspective just how rough of a week 1 they had, just gives you an idea. Now, as we approach week 2, we have the Chicago Bears on hand. And I think, again, this should be a far softer matchup. And in that, they should be able to move the chains. They should be able to get themselves red zone rushing opportunities. And when those opportunities do arrive, we saw this most recent week in terms of the red zone, in terms of short yardage opportunities, David Montgomery is still their go-to guy within those categories. Number 29, we have Aaron Jones. Look, Aaron Jones, he's taking on a tough run-stopping defense in the form of the Atlanta Falcons that just shut down Bucky Irving. But even with that being the case, and let's say, for example, Aaron Jones is going to be efficient this week, it doesn't matter what the matchup is, it's the lack of touches in comparison to someone like Jordan Mason that is incredibly concerning. Jordan Mason nearly had twice as many rushing attempts in week 1. In a matchup in which, yes, they were in a negative game script, but Mason just looked like the better runner. So if that's going to continue to be the case, then they are going to require a lot of receiving work in the direction of Aaron Jones for him to be fantasy relevant. Really did bail himself out with that deep reception down the field against the linebacker. I don't know why the safety decided to go ahead and shift in the wrong direction. He should have played the outside leverage there for the linebacker. Nonetheless, Aaron Jones finding success even despite his age and even despite only 11 touches, as long as he's given receiving utilization or the eventual and occasional goal line work, he will be fantasy relevant. But with Jordan Mason continuing to build his momentum, it does scare me for his upside. Number 30 is Jacory Croskey-Merritt. Some of you call him Bill. I call him JCM to make it easy. In week 1, he broke out. On Sunday morning, we all saw the inactive, healthy scratch of Chris Rodriguez Jr., so I immediately moved Jacory Croskey-Merritt into my top 36 running back rankings for the Sunday morning live stream. Now, in the efforts of the 23 total snaps he played, in comparison to Ekeler's 33, Jeremy McNichols' 13, he had 10 total carries for 82 yards and a rushing touchdown. He accounted for 50% of the running back rushing attempts in week 1, had an 8.2 yard per carry average, 4.2 yards after contact per attempt, a 30% missed tackle force rate. He was number 2 amongst all running backs in terms of a rushing success rate at 60%, only behind Zach Charbonnet in week 1. With the potential of him continuing to get more opportunity going forward, considering how efficient he was in week 1, of course, we would assume that in a short week, taking on the Green Bay Packers in week 2, he may see more looks. But let's not forget, the Green Bay Packers just annihilated the rushing threat of Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. So what they'll be able to accomplish against JCM does have me a little bit worried. Therefore, I have him at number 30 in comparison to if he had an easier matchup where I would put him. Number 31, we have Kenneth Walker, who takes on Pittsburgh, who, again, like I mentioned earlier, the Pittsburgh Steelers couldn't stop the run. 27 carries for 134 and a rushing touchdown against them this most recent week in the efforts of Breece Hall and Braylon Allen. But look, the thing about Kenneth Walker is that I'm worried. I think we have to sound the alarm because not only was he going ahead and losing some valuable opportunities, especially near the goal line, but on top of it was highly inefficient in terms of his overall opportunities. I mean, 50% of his overall rushing attempts were stuffed at the line of scrimmage. The offensive line not helping him out, even though he is the primary receiving back of this offense, having come away with 3 targets, 3 catches, while Charbonnet had 0 targets. I still think that if he's going to continue to be inefficient, it's just going to lead to the organization giving him less touches, which in my mind makes him a lower tier RB3 going into the week despite a potentially advantageous matchup on hand, unless he is given more opportunities in terms of outside zone, which again, he only had 3 rushing attempts out of his 10 in terms of outside zone, which for a Clint Kubiak offense is scary. That's got to be like 7 of the 10 rather than just 3. Number 32. We have Jordan Mason. Look, coming away with 16 total touches for 8 fantasy points, we will take it. Especially considering this offense is beginning to ascend. The first 3 quarters of their week 1 performance were completely garbage. So if we're going to go ahead and ascend and take on the Atlanta Falcons and have an opportunity of potentially having a neutral game script, if not a positive game script, it should lead to, again, very similar levels of opportunity from Jordan Mason to be implicated for more touches within the upcoming matchup. He looks fresh, he looks clean, and he looks like he's going to take over the shot from Aaron Jones in just a couple weeks. Number 33, we have Isiah Pacheco. Look, taking on the Eagles is not an easy matchup. Now, even though Javonte Williams, Miles Sanders combined for 107 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, 5.63 yards per carry on average, the fact of the matter is the Kansas City Chiefs and Andy Reid don't want to run the ball. They don't feel comfortable giving more opportunity in the direction of Isiah Pacheco. So until he sees himself 10 plus touches per game on a consistent enough basis, I can't feel comfortable ranking him any higher than my number 33 going into the given week, despite the fact that there should be an opportunity for him to be fantasy relevant. Dylan Sampson, one of the waiver wire potential pickups that you have an opportunity of grabbing going into this week. We are not 100% certain as to the status of Quinshon Judkins. If in fact he is going to join this backfield and play this week, there is an opportunity in which he could be relevant, especially considering Raheem Sanders and Jerome Ford combined for 9 carries for 11 yards and 1 rushing touchdown, 1 target. The rest of the targets going in the direction of Dylan Sampson. 8 targets on 16 routes, ran a 50% target rate. Again, as 11.5 point underdogs this week, we would assume there should be a lot of opportunities within the receiving game for Dylan Sampson. In a full PPR, far more valuable than the number 34, but in a half PPR, I think this is a pretty safe spot considering we are anticipating the return of Judkins. Number 35, speaking of receiving upside, going into the Thursday night matchup, which is considered the second highest potential scoring game based on Vegas totals this week at 48.5. If we're going to be in a position in which the Packers run stop defense annihilates the rushing threat of course, Jacory Croskey-Merritt, Jaden Daniels, and Austin Ekeler, that should lead to a lot more receiving opportunities. I went ahead and I checked out Betr earlier and I was like, okay, you know what? The number at 1.5 receptions for Austin Ekeler, I think is very achievable. That's something that I'm certainly going ahead and putting a play together with going into Thursday, potentially alongside of, Josh Jacobs, anytime touchdown, considering he's accomplished that in the last 9 consecutive games, going back to last year in the regular season. As long as we're going to be in a potential negative game script here, it should lead to far more opportunity for Ekeler in comparison to this most recent week, which still, he had himself 33 total snaps in comparison to JCM's 23. The final player I wanted to mention is RJ Harvey. Look, he came away with 6 carries for 70 yards, but what was incredibly worrisome was the fact that Tyler Batty was the primary receiving running back. 6 targets, 2 catches, 16 yards. until Harvey gets himself more utilization within the receiving game, which he saw less targets than Dobbins, he truly is a fringe low-end RB3, high-end RB4. And there could be a conversation in which we are playing alternative options in comparison to him, like a Kenneth Gainwell, even going into the given week, taking on the Indianapolis Colts that did give up over 6 yards per carry to the Dolphins running backs. Now, before I close out today's video, I wanted to go ahead and share with you guys something that I share with you every single episode in regards to every position. It's in regards to matchups. I've gone ahead and isolated the running back rushing statistics a lot from week 1. Obviously, once we get a bigger picture after the first 4 weeks of the season, we'll begin to understand which matchups are truly the most advantageous going into the given week. With only 1 week of data, it's really not enough to be able to feel confident regarding a specific play. But we have seen tendencies from some of these teams thus far, and hopefully for our sake, we'll be able to see these trends continue in order to understand which matchups are truly the most advantageous going into the given week. So as you can tell, the Buffalo Bills allowed the most running back rushing statistics in week 1. Of course, Derrick Henry, doing majority of that overall workload. But I primarily just isolate running back rushing statistics because the receiving work of a running back is primarily dictated not by matchup, but rather the quarterback's tendency to check it down, the running back's receiving ability, and additionally, the tendencies of offensive coordinators keeping their running backs in the backfield on third downs as a pass blocker or as someone that is running a route. Those definitely making a huge difference in the grand scheme. All right, so these, of course, are the top 16, and then we have the tougher matchups, the teams that weren't as successful. Again, the Washington Commanders, incredible in terms of stopping the New York Giants. The Chargers were great, the Packers were great, the Raiders were great. So maybe this will go ahead and kind of give you some sort of inclination as to what could occur in week 2, but until we get further information, potentially a full month workload, we'll be still sitting here wondering whether or not these are going to be the official kind of run stop teams going into this upcoming season. All right, with this all covered, thank you everybody for watching. Be sure to click the like button. I'll be live streaming later tonight starting at about 7 p.m. PST, so if you're interested, be sure to swing on by. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.